Hello, everyone. We're going to begin in just a minute, letting everybody come into the webinar. Hello and welcome. Welcome to How Companies Can Harness AI for Social Impact and Competitive Advantage, a webinar that's presented by Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence and the Stanford Technology Ventures Program. I'm John Robichaux, Director of Education here at Stanford High. Today's talk provides a taste of the executive education program offered this summer by High and STVP called Leading Social Impact Strategy, Harnessing the Power and the Purpose of AI. In this highly interactive program, participants are going to connect social impact to firm strategy, develop frameworks for social impact review, and create communication plans that help their firms do well by doing good. Webinar attendees, you will receive a 10% discount code for this program, so please keep an eye out for that email, which will give you further information coming your way after today's session. Today, I'm thrilled to be introducing Chuck Eesley and James Cham. Chuck Eesley is an associate professor and the W.M. Keck Foundation faculty scholar in Stanford's Department of Management Science and Engineering. His research focuses on how educational institution and policy environments shape high-growth technology entrepreneurship, a mission very close to those of us here at High and STVP. Chuck's guest for this webinar is James Cham. James is a partner at Bloomberg Beta, which is a venture capital firm backed by Bloomberg LP. James is particularly focused on investing in data-centric and machine learning-related companies that are powering the future of work, another topic of extraordinary interest to those of us here at Stanford High and STVP. In this conversation, James and Chuck will be exploring how companies can use AI to gain competitive advantage while simultaneously having a positive impact on the world. We'll reserve the final 15 minutes of today's webinar for audience questions, so please put your questions in the Zoom Q&A. You're encouraged to post questions at any time during the talk, and you can use the upvote function to influence which questions will get asked during the Q&A session at the end of today's conversation. Thank you again for joining us. And with that, I want to turn things over to our host, Chuck Eesley.
Great, thanks, John. So James, it's really great to be with you. My students have really benefited over the years from the time you spent in our class as a guest speaker, mentor, and giving feedback to their startup presentation. So thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to the conversation and interested to see what it generates in terms of questions and discussion with our online audience.
This will be a lot of fun. I will just caveat all of this by saying that my data, of course, is entirely anecdotal, and Chuck has probably done some massive, extensive, scalable study on anything I'm speculating on. And if his eyebrows start to raise because I'm saying something wrong, he'll be nice about it, but then you should probably Google it later.
So James, you have a great vantage point, actually, as an early stage investor into the ways that technology is changing how we live and work. And I've been looking forward to the chance today to pick your brain about emerging technologies and trends and how AI may impact society, both positively or negatively in the years to come. So before we get into how AI relates to social impact and competitive advantage, let's start by demystifying AI a little bit. So can you talk about what AI actually is in 2022 and how it differs from the somewhat mysterious godlike technology that it's sometimes depicted as?
You know, it's so funny that in many ways, when we talk about AI and we talk about this new wave of sort of incredible changes in the ways that we think about AI, you know, sort of mostly driven by machine learning and mostly driven by neural nets. What's interesting about it is that like our core rhetoric is wrong, right? When we talk about AI, we talk about like machine learning, it's almost as if we get like the center of attention off. And by talking about it in terms of the machine, we miss the real point of it, which is that more often than not, what's really happening is that there are a whole set of human decisions or observations that are basically being summarized and distilled so that a model can consistently make interesting inferences and decisions, or inferences and observations and predictions based on it. And I think that in some ways, that shift in how we talk about it and how the difference between how we talk about it versus what people actually do on the ground is maybe one of the biggest disconnects today, and ultimately results in a lot of wasted money.
Right. Yeah. The terminology really puts the emphasis on the machine and the machine learning, and abstracts away from everything else that's going around that, to almost kind of anthropomorphize the computers doing all the key action.
That's right. And I think that now this goes both ways, right? That in some ways that anthropomorphization of the machine gives businesses opportunities to do different things, like for good and ill, to be honest, on the one hand. But on the other hand, like that's good from a marketing point of view, but from an actual, what are you building today? My observation is that oftentimes on the business side, there's just not a finger feel for how these applications are actually being built. And in some ways, sort of when I helped start the fund about 8 years ago, we thought a lot about investing in AI, and I kind of feel like we sort of probably missed part of the boat, that actually part of what AI actually is about taking data seriously. And there's a way in which, like when I was a software developer 2 decades ago, I built applications and I cared about the business rules and I cared maybe about the database schema, but I didn't really care about the data. And there's a way now where businesses today take data so much more seriously, and it results in fundamentally different types of processes and opportunities.
Very interesting. So even if AI isn't miraculous or omnipotent, contemporary machine learning algorithms are very different from traditional software, as you were kind of alluding to. Can you explain a little bit about how AI and machine learning is conceptually different from previous software tools?
Sure. In sort of in my old world of building software, and I would, sort of document and talk to people about a bunch of business rules, sort of, if this thing goes over that number, then please help me figure it out and change some policy, or, sort of send a different report to someone. And what's sort of fascinating about this new world, right, is that you end up taking a whole set of observations, right? And then you say, okay, sort of based on these set of observations, we know, and we have a certain set of outcomes, and those little predictions. And then by like sort of distilling all of those, you're able to come up with better, consistent predictions. And what's interesting about that, though, is that like, sort of just going back to my software development days, because I just had a conversation with a friend about this, where I basically had 2 tricks as a software developer. I was a manager or a product manager. My 2 tricks were I could either cut scope, say I can do less, or say it'll take longer. And like that was basically it. But the truth is, I fundamentally understood that given enough time, I could probably build the application you're talking about. What's interesting about the machine learning world is that that's not really clear, right? That in some ways, it isn't clear whether in the data that we're collecting or that we're putting together, whether there's actually enough juice in the data to actually make interesting predictions. And the other thing that's true is that in my old world, I would think a lot about QA, and I sort of have quality assurance, right? Testing. And I'd have some idea that things would work or not work. But my goal is always to make things work. And my assumption is like, well, some magical point, we'll stop off enough bugs that this whole thing will work. But what's fascinating about ML world, machine learning world, is that like built into the system is this assumption that you will get false positives and false negatives, that you will be wrong often enough, right? That you'll have to build that assumption into the system.
It's more probabilistic or stochastic in nature.
In part because it's a high dimensional function that, you're going to get like, where you're going to sort of like approximate things and you get things wrong every so often.
Right. Well, but before we geek out too much here about data, and there's lots of other interesting issues to touch on that the data part brings up in terms of more narrow data sets versus broader data sets. Maybe we'll circle back to some of those. But let's get into some of the imagining the future of AI. Before getting into the specifics on how companies are dealing with AI and machine learning right now. Perhaps we can look a bit further into the future to start out with, because we know a lot of the AI developments that are going on right now are going to shape business and society in profound ways, and that's driving a lot of the interest here. So what do you think, in your view, what's a dystopian future for AI look like? And what does a more optimistic or even perhaps utopian future for AI look like?
I mean, I think not surprisingly, I think that to me, the thing that everyone is worried about is mostly wrong. I think there's a focus on there's sort of a focus on potential harm that sort of we're just not going to really understand. And there's this focus also on sort of what I think is actually the most powerful part about AI, which is that AI will be able to deal with relatively ambiguous situations in which we can't write clear business rules, and it'll come up with relatively good guesses. And critically, those guesses or those predictions will all be centralized. And I think there's this power in centralization, which we don't really appreciate, because it is only when we centralize something that we could also have the chance to fix things and make modifications in fundamental ways. And what's interesting to me, at least, is that, sort of let's take, say, some mortgage approval process, right? In the old world, sort of, I've got some horrible bias as some claims processor or some mortgage approver. And then, sort of your ability to convince me that I should change my mind, you could do that. But the problem is there are 1,000 of me. And so you've got to roll out this entire change management process in which you're going to say, oh, you know what, let's just make sure that people are not biased in some super subtle way or some super obvious way. And let's roll that out. And what's fascinating about machine learning is now you have a single place where you make a change, you make a decision to say, you know what, we're going to alter the way that we're going to get rid of a certain bias, or we're going to be at least conscious of a certain bias. Like, your ability to fix that in one place is like incredibly powerful. And there's a way in which one of the dangers with machine learning is, in part because we treat it like some magical godlike being, we never think about changing it. But the entire value of it is the fact that as you get more data, you change the model, right? And you change the model in one place. And so to me, the fear is the dystopian future. There are two of them, right? One is we don't use machine learning enough. And then the other one is we treat machine learning as something static, like something in concrete. And we treat it like rules or laws rather than something that should be constantly adjusting to the world in front of us.
Interesting. This conversation about the potential benefits to centralizing decision making reminds me of some of the academic work that Shra Goel at Harvard and Johan Ugander here at Stanford have been doing around the criminal justice system, and in particular the great variation among judges in making decisions to let people out on bail, and that could be standardized in a way that actually reduces the risk of flight and creates a much more just system for making those bail decisions, is one example.
And so now you're going to have to add those citations onto your Twitter stream so that we can all find it, first of all. But second of all, I will just note that if you think about the popular conversation, or even the conversation that happens inside a team when they talk about these sort of things, that all the focus goes on the times that the model is wrong. And it describes all the ways that the model is wrong and how terrible that is. And it is true that the model is often wrong, or is wrong occasionally. And when that happens, it's terrible. But it is only terrible compared to some utopian vision of something where everything is perfect, as opposed to the real world we live in. And it is also only terrible, again, if we think of the machine learning model as something that is, like a law, as opposed to, let's say, I think we talked about this, like my favorite sociological paper on machine learning is this paper called Street Level Algorithms by these two guys at Stanford, friends of yours.
Yep, Michael Bernstein and Ali Al-Khatib.
That's right. And in their model, they say, you know what, you've got to imagine a world in which the model is going to be wrong, and thus treat them like judges, or treat them like police officers, bureaucrats, and in which we need to create structures by which you get an appeal process where you figure out how to identify where you're wrong, and thus have entire structures to support that. And that's actually only possible or enabled in part because these models are so much more economically efficient. And so then you can build up all this support in order to make things work better.
Yeah, that's a super interesting paper. We'll have to link to that one as well. It gives a lot of really fascinating examples where the AI algorithms have gotten things wrong as well, like with YouTube and mislabeling transgender related videos as sexually explicit content, or not catching cartoon content that had shown violence. And they make the point that if you just have this high level ethics policy or philosophy, without the recognition that you need to make these kinds of updates and changes in response to the kind of street level bureaucracy, as they draw upon the analogy, that you can really get into trouble.
And okay, and so part of this is also the shift that's happened probably over the last 5 years, where I think that there is continued hope and excitement on technical advances, but I'm convinced that all the low-hanging fruit and all the opportunities for significant improvement is going to come from thinking about these things as from a sociological point of view, or from a managerial point of view, or from a product point of view, in which case you are no longer hoping that some great engineer or some great researcher will come through with some breakthrough, but instead you take the product and the models as they are right now, and you say, you know what, we now understand their limitations, or if we don't understand the limitations, we need to understand what they're really good at or what they're not good at. And in fact, sort of one of my favorite startup founders used to run this session for executives where he would say, you know what, actually, I can give you some great lecture or lots of great videos, but the really valuable thing to do is to spend 3 hours and just build a machine learning model. It turns out that it's really easy right now. We'll give you a bunch of code. We'll give you a bunch of pictures of pumpkins and socks. And then, and you just modify little chunks of code, right? Make little swap in and out different things, and you'll see how good these models are and how scalable they are as far as recognizing pumpkins versus socks. But on the other hand, you also see how they're fiddly and dumb reasons why they break. And in that way, you'll build there's a German word for it, but they'll build a finger feel for how to think about this in a way that's much more concrete and much more useful than, sort of watching another video about how scary it all is.
I think this is such a great point, James, and maybe worth dwelling on for another moment here, just to draw out, make sure that folks understand the analogy with street level bureaucracies. This was work that came out of sociology, and basically said, it's easy to have a law or a kind of high level philosophy about policing, but then the police officers on the ground, or whatever the context might be, doing the day-to-day work, they see kind of edge cases, and they see things like street performers, for instance, and so some vague lines about where there's criminality there versus where there isn't. And so they've got to make these decisions in response to situations that were not kind of in the standard operating procedures when the law was created. And so similarly here, how you're talking about the kind of sociological view or broader human context around the algorithm. The algorithm was trained on a certain, perhaps narrow data set, but in deploying it in the real world, that's where you get the street level reactions and edge cases, and where perhaps getting some experience with actually building a model and seeing how that plays out is helpful to realize that you've got to make these modifications along the way and have some decision-making structure set up for that.
Yeah, and the thing that I can't emphasize enough is that this is in many ways fundamentally different than traditional software development. And I think that, sort of even if you've successfully shepherded a whole series of digital transformations or built, sort of some multi-year ERP system, it is still true that your intuition will be just a little bit off, and that it's very valuable for both business owners, but also, to be honest, sort of senior technical managers to go through a process like that, just because then they will sort of see the world a little bit differently.
Very good. Well, before we get into Q&A, I'd love to spend a little bit of time looking at how executives and leaders can and should be making these real world decisions around AI right now. We've started to get into this a little bit, but first, where do you think companies are feeling the most tension right now as they think about using AI to reach business goals while also wanting to be responsible global citizens?
Mm, you know, I think that part of it is that oftentimes these new projects are fit inside some broader digital transformation project, and there's an assumption that things will work on a schedule, sort of like the sort of schedule that you would have expected sort of normal software development to happen in. And that, I think that's like one big risk. And then I think the other big risk is, you kind of buy into, so look, I have nothing against system integrators or management consultants. I worked at BCG, had a great time. I think they're very good folks. But there's a way in which I think some organizations are conceding too much power to vendors or consultants, when the truth is we're still at a point where you need to build these capabilities in-house, right? And it's not as if there's this sort of myth that you need to hire PhDs from Stanford, although you should hire more PhDs from Stanford. They should all get good jobs. But the truth is that in a lot of cases right now, the technology is right in front of you and open sourced and available right now. And actually solutions that are good enough for that first set of problems and understanding sort of what kind of data we should be gathering, all those sorts of problems really should be in-house solutions rather than conceded to someone else. And so that's one side. I think the other side, of course, is like the overpromising, which often causes lots of problems. And then the last side, which is like, there's often a fundamental misunderstanding of machine learning in which, because it seems so futuristic, we miss the fact that it is fundamentally conservative. Not conservative in a political way, but conservative in the sense that these models, by their very nature, reflect the past, right? They reflect past decisions and whether those decisions worked or not, past conditions. And so as we move along, there needs to be this realization that like conditions on the floor are going to change. And we're going to need to think about the model as a way to make us consistent and a way to sort of maybe get additional insights, but not necessarily sort of predict the future. And I think that shift is a common mistake.
Right. I think there's a lot of just basic kind of walk before you run kinds of things to think about there.
Right. That's right. And then I think the other part about it, of course, is that the fun thing about being involved right now is all these systems are dynamic. Expectations as far as privacy, expectations around to what extent machine learning models should be part of our lives or not part of our lives, those are all shifting, right? And I think that having a close pulse on how expectations are changing will be very important, because sort of you go too far ahead of people, you'll get into Wall Street Journal for bad reasons. But if you lag too far behind, you'll never get any of the sort of cost savings or business benefits because you'll be just a little too cautious. There's a guy I know named Cesar Hidalgo. I don't know if do you remember him? He was at MIT, is an economist, and he did this moral census of Americans' expectations around what they would let the machine do or not do, and to what extent they would trust the machine or not. And I think that those sorts of things are fascinating, mostly from the point of view of, as a business, at least in 2022, what are the sorts of offerings I can provide to people that they will accept or not accept, or treat more seriously or less seriously? And I think that sort of feel of the ground is really important.
Great. So I think, as you kind of alluded to, you see a lot in the popular press about AI that points to some of the pitfalls and things that can go wrong, like Joy Buolamwini's work on facial recognition, not working across genders and races and so on. But do you have examples of companies who seem to have an especially interesting or enlightened approach to AI, to look on the positive side a bit more about what are some of the good practices?
I mean, okay, so I think that, let me take it from a couple points of view. I do think that it remains true that the biggest tech companies in the world have been actually really thoughtful. That in some ways, they are the ones who are going to be bearing lots of pain and lots of criticism, but it's entirely worth reading through either the research papers from Google and Facebook and Microsoft, just to get a sense of like where they're getting attacked or not attacked and what's working or not. And they've been super thoughtful about it. So on the one hand, and then I will be also honest that like on the startup side, you see an incredible amount of pragmatism, right? That folks who are decades-long AI researchers will still say, you know what, when I first build the first versions of this application, I'm just going to write normal business rules, and I'm going to see what I can get away with before I really need to start collecting data at scale, right? So that's one piece. And then I think that if you look at companies, sort of, I don't know, there's a company called Primer that does large-scale summarization of text, right? And their primary application right now is in national security, because the insight is that there's all this information out there in the world, but the good, and a CIA analyst is only going to be able to read 5 to 10 sort of really deep pieces a day. And if the language isn't something they don't understand, right, then they're not going to be, then they're going to have to be, they're going to read 3 of them, right? And
Sure.
What's fascinating about that, though, is that on the one hand, the summarization works quite well, works across different languages, and it will draw ties together. But what's fascinating about it is that it assumes that it'll be wrong often enough. And so it just provides enough connections for the analyst that they can then say, you know what, this idea and this idea, actually, although the machine doesn't think they're similar, actually, I'm smart enough to know that they're connected, and then be able to draw that tie. And that's sort of what I characterize
sort of the connection between the machine intelligence and the human intelligence.
That's right. There's sort of like this slightly false dichotomy right now around, oh, does this automate or augment? I think that that's like mostly used to waste a bunch of people's time, to be totally honest, right? I think that the reality is that like everything automates and augments at the same time, right? Sort of, and the real question is always, so how effective is it really? When is it wrong? And will make enough of a difference to make a difference in my business?
Interesting. So you've spoken some about AI as providing some critical advantages in either reducing costs or creating efficiencies in decision making. Can you say more about that? What does that workflow look like? I know some companies are intentionally thinking about these workflows where you have AI or algorithm evaluator as part of it. What might the right kinds of automation be a good thing for societies and workforces at large?
So, in normal software, traditional software world, right? What did I used to build? I used to build a database. I used to build a bunch of forms that connected one to another, and then I'd make some decision, right? And so like that's the old world. And I think what's interesting about sort of like those sorts of processes are begging to be like begging to not just be digitized, but then also begging for some amount of observation and consistency from machine. And that's sort of the sort of ideal case for machine learning, that there's almost a way in which sort of the version of machine learning that works is it says, you know what, you just submitted this case in this workflow or fill out this form. Let me just say that like 80% of the, or most of the time when someone submits this kind of form, it results in this, you make this kind of decision and it's wrong. Or, and that sort of like ability to characterize what is like a bunch of unstructured information and then sort of say, you know what, conceptually, this is close to this other thing, right? And this other pattern, that sort of thing is just sitting on the floor. It's just begging to be done. Now, the reality is that most of those processes right now exist inside email and chat and phone calls, right? But those processes, which are incredibly valuable, are just begging to be digitized and worked with on that sort of next level. Now, of course, once you do that, and once everyone knows you do that, then that creates other problems, right? Because once I know, as someone going through a workflow, understands that, oh, there's some machine that's in the middle of it that might make some decisions or might characterize things, then I, of course, will try to get around it, right? That I will come up with other solutions. But the fascinating thing about that is like, that's not a new problem. That is an age-old problem, right? Sort of, I think there's a famous paper about like, the folly of sort of wanting A but encouraging B, or
but
whatever,
measuring
right?
B.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think that problem is a problem with humans and dynamic systems. And that's just a reminder that you cannot build the model once, right? That you need to consistently change it. I'm sorry, there you go. That you need to consistently be able to sort of like continue to modify it on the fly and continue to understand how the world in front of you is changing.
Right. It's this intertwining of the technical issues and capabilities with the natural people issues that always come up in organizations.
That's right. I have to make a pitch that I do think in some ways, the talk of ethical AI sort of misses part of the point, that instead the the sort of like task before us right now is just understanding where AI sits, where it's situated. And I think that that's the actual hard part. You know, there are a lot of questions that are going to be unanswerable because they're like problems with the human condition. And then there are a lot of questions where the answers are super obvious, but the really hard part, just knowing like, so where does machine learning actually fit into all these other things that we've done, and what are the implications of it?
Yeah, well, this is the really interesting part. So let's see if we can scratch a little bit deeper in this particular topic, because I think it's really interesting, actually. So we often see technology companies that are caught off balance these days, and they wind up in the Washington Post or somewhere, forced to think about their social impact where there's a significant backlash. So do you think it's realistic to ask companies to formulate a strategy around AI that can get ahead of these major issues and PR headaches versus just waiting until some crisis forces the issue?
You know, I think that it's, in a lot of cases, it's just really hard to know, right? That it's just really hard to know what are going to be the second, third, or fourth order implications of some new technology. And I'm sorry, just something on my camera here. I seem to be zooming in.
We're getting a zoom in on your face occasionally.
Yeah,
There we
a
go.
little
Back to
awkward, right? A
normal
little
now.
awkward. And so I have like 2 points of view about that. So one is, I think there's a way in which, like, if you spend too much time worrying about potential harm, to be honest, you'll just never do anything, right? And that won't help anyone. There's, you know, I think there's a joke that I would tell that, you know, if you thought about like examining the potential harm of the first compiler, right? That you might never build a compiler because you just don't know all the possible ways that a software compiler in this whatever, the mid 50s might be used for good or evil. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I will just note that in most companies, my apologies here. I don't know exactly what's going on here. Hold on one moment. It's kind of funny. Does this work? Okay.
I think so. There must be some AI running in the background.
That's right. That's right. I don't really know what's going on here. I think there's something wrong with my camera. Okay. In most companies, there's not enough slack. The actual issue is there's not enough time to spend thinking about potential issues or building up sort of like the backup plan for what will happen, in part because people are running around with their heads chopped off because there's so many things right in front of you. And I think, and so in some ways, I think the concern about mistakes or potential harm, that actually masks the deeper problem, which is that companies and teams oftentimes just don't have enough slack to actually come up with contingency plans before the problem happens, right? And I think that's sort of like, I don't know, that's partly the fault of management consultants like me before. That's partly the fault of, you know, sort of, I think professors in general, or management professors in general, have like preached for the value of slack, right? But I think like that's the actual issue. It's not a potential harm or ethics question.
Interesting. Well, there's a lot of really fascinating questions coming in. So I want to get to those next. But before we do that, if people in the audience today are interested in following some thought leaders in the AI space, is there anyone who comes to mind that you'd recommend they pay attention to?
I mean, I do think, you know, sort of, I do pay a lot of attention to Ali and sort of the things that he writes.
This is Ali Al-Khatib, Michael Bernstein's co-author, who's now at University of San Francisco, I believe, in their Data and Ethics Center.
Yeah, and I feel like he's just sort of, I feel like he's endlessly creative about sort of his critique. Like his critique is, or his attacks on AI and business feel grounded in sort of reality. You don't have to agree with his core point of view, but like I think his concerns about it are sort of well grounded. I've kept a list in I'll put it on Twitter again. I've kept a list of like sort of various writers and writing that I pay attention to, because it's true that right now a lot of these questions, like I feel like we're not paying attention to the right folks, right? You know, like there's, you know, some gal inside Facebook who's writing a bunch of rants inside their own private conversations, but it's not available to the rest of us right now. And instead we get sort of like more theoretical, sort of higher level questions.
Yeah, yeah. I know these are important issues that a lot of companies are grappling with, and how to create that kind of slack to be able to think a step or two ahead rather than just reacting. So a question came up from something that you had mentioned earlier, which was the pitfalls of attaching AI projects to digital transformation projects. I can imagine that's something that a lot of companies out there are doing. Can you say more about why that's a bad idea exactly?
So I think the thing about digital transformation is that in a lot of these cases, we're dealing with software applications and technology that we spent 20 to 30 years figuring out how to do. And thus organizations actually have pretty good intuition about what works and doesn't work. And they actually do a pretty good job of project planning and imagining what will happen. And I think in a lot of cases, certainly there are parts of AI or machine learning where you're building some chatbot for something. And then in those cases, I think that, those fit well inside maybe some initiative. But that sort of core ability to make your organization smart, or to make it, what's the name of the guy? Chris Argyris? What, do you know who I'm talking about, from like the late 90s, who wrote about learning organizations?
I'm trying to remember. This is another one we'll have to dig up and put into our Twitter stream on this.
Yeah, but in some ways, like the truly interesting opportunities around AI are to make your organization not just theoretically a learning organization or just a metaphor, but literally a learning organization in which your core most important decisions and processes are both captured digitally, characterized, and then also, sort of you're now put in a position where you build a model so that you can make better decisions consistently over time. And to be honest, like that doesn't happen, like that happens very rarely, and it happens only in a few industries, but that's sort of like the opportunity in front of us.
Right. So it's about the organizational change, not just about the technology transformation.
That's right. And then I think that but also it's about the uncertainty. I'm sorry, it's not actually, because like good digital transformation has lots of organizational and sociological implications, but it's the fact that for this kind of process, it is still new enough and open enough that it is much more of an exploration thing than it is we can just sort of come up with some schedule and figure out and promise to get something done by a certain date.
I see. So another question that came up is about open source software. So a lot of AI and ML software is currently distributed as open source software. So if we're thinking about the competitive advantage side of this and where that can come from exactly, for either the vendors or the users, what's the source, do you think, of the competitive advantage then? Is it the data or the expert knowledge around the particular business context and operations, or is it something about the engineering resources to be able to integrate all of this together?
As it always is, the answer is a mix. But let me just highlight a couple of things that I think are surprising for most people. I think that, we are just coming out of an era in which everything was collected, that data was collected in sort of a widespread way. And I think we're just entering into an era where people will start to realize, oh, you know what, actually, we're probably collecting too much data, that the actual insights come from figuring out what pieces of data are useful and not useful, which pieces are corrupt, which pieces are actually sort of consistent with a business goal we've got. And then that sort of like filter, which comes from a mix of using machine learning to maybe come up with some equivalent of principal component analysis, but also comes from a lot of human judgment, right? That sort of thing. I think that's, of course, where the virtuous cycle really happens, right? Because anyone will be able to collect data from the outside. There's so much open source information out there. And then there'll be plenty of information inside the organization. But what's interesting is that like getting the two to like actually match up and figuring out here's the actual thing we want to predict on a consistent basis. Here's the thing that'll actually change our business, right? That's the interesting sort of clever moat that I think a lot of people will be developing over the next decade.
Right. And we know from the research literature that the kinds of organizational changes that need to go on to be able to integrate and bring all those things together into the kind of learning organization that you were talking about earlier is very difficult.
That's right. Or maybe even utopian.
Maybe even utopian. So going back to the strategies to help humans work effectively with machines in this kind of augmentation cycle, what specifically does that look like? You know, the question for me is reminding me of some work by a faculty member that we've hired recently into the department, Arvind Karunakaran, who looks at AI evaluators and the interactions that they have with the software developers that are developing the AI algorithms to check for the fairness and transparency and all the good properties that you would want. But can you say more your thoughts there, James, around the right way to set up this augmentation in the right way between human intelligence and machine learning?
So have you thought a little bit about a couple trends that we've already come up with? So like there's a large amount of data being captured. There's so many workflows that are now being digitized. And also critically, most interestingly enough, there's like a number of organizations that have defined their business processes and workflows by APIs, right? And those APIs are these natural points where you can say, here's all the information that we've captured, and then here's a clear way that we're going to evaluate and understand, right? And in some ways like that, those sort of little choke points are what are interesting for, I think, a lot of organizations as they think about these things.
Interesting. So another whole area that we haven't really touched on much yet, but that seems like it may be important in the coming years, or what trends in policy or regulation should companies anticipate? You know, it feels a bit like the kind of early days of anticipating that there might be more climate regulations with a lot more attention on the impacts of infusing the society with AI algorithms, and some skepticism around whether companies can truly self-regulate if they're driven by the profit motive, and say the AI algorithm that surfaces the more controversial content, which might be more likely to be, say, misinformation, is getting more views and more clicks. Do you in looking at potential startups to invest in, or thinking about the approach to machine learning going forward, to what extent are you thinking about potential policy changes or regulation of tech that might be coming?
You know, so I do think that the best new business models and the best new regulation are driven by shifts in the economics of technology. And one of the dirty secrets that regulators have not figured out yet is that actually doing inference, actually sort of like having the machine learning model make a prediction, is really cheap and is really, really easy. And there's a way in which, once regulators realize that, they'll be able to do the equivalent of, you know, when folks would try to figure out whether a bank was going to go out of business if some business condition changed, those sort of stress tests, right? You know, those stress tests are really important to understand the health of our economic, our sort of finance system. And you will get the equivalent of those sort of stress tests for a whole set of practices, right? And I think once regulators understand that these APIs can be pinged for like fractions of a penny to figure out whether or not, and we can shoot over like 15,000 examples and figure out whether they're like sort of shows that you're sort of secretly racist or not, right? All those sorts of opportunities do open up. And I think that's mostly like as businesses or as business people, we should be encouraging that, because I think that actually that regulatory burden in some ways is much, much less than the horrible world we live in right now, where you get to go through some horrible paper audit and wait for like have some guy or gal visit and then go through a bunch of like random PDFs. And like, that's a terrible world, right? And so I think that shift is right in front of us. And I'm, you know, sort of like I see from leading corporations, but also leading law firms like that, they're all planning for that and they're doing it in different ways. And then it is an area where I'm actively looking to invest, where I think that, you know, sort of that, because you put that in the middle of sort of an organization, then you unlock and you both like create opportunities for all sorts of good to happen, but also you actually fundamentally lower the cost of doing good.
Interesting. I know on the academic side, there's a lot of really interesting academic work that's been going on out of our CS department and a lot of other places as well around the globe on algorithmic fairness and tests that could be run given various parameters to check for that. So it would be interesting to envision a future where that potentially gets used,
Right.
similar to the stress tests.
And then you do see that, like, on the one hand, on the cutting edge are these questions about what kind of data should we provide, what's the optimal type of data we should provide, and what are the optimal sort of outcomes. But like literally today, like sort of a smart regulator really should be going to like banks and saying, okay, we know you've built APIs for all of this, right? Stick this inside some staging environment. Let us run through 50,000 cases and come up with some statistical representation of what happens, right? And that sort of thing is right there. And then, the banks don't quite want to talk about it yet. And then the regulators are not quite savvy enough yet. But I actually think the banks should be encouraging it. And they say, hey, we want to be, this is going to happen. And this actually dramatically reduces our costs if we do it in this way.
Interesting. So here's a question that I know you've given some thought to. How much, because we've talked about this before, how much will AI change the nature of work and the structure of companies in the next decade? What kinds of legacy jobs might be automated, the questioner is wondering about, or what new AI ML management jobs will be created?
I mean, we're still early in treating and taking seriously these machine learning models. But there will be a day at some point where a manager's status won't be measured based on the size of their portfolio or the number of people who report to them, but instead of might be measured by the number of like sort of machine learning processes that they're managing, right? And that they're running. So that's one piece. The other piece is like, you can never underestimate how tricky human beings are, that we are infinitely sly and clever. And so our ability to, so there's this dream that, oh, we build one perfect machine learning model and then no one will ever have to maintain it or change it. Like, I cannot predict many things, but I can predict with 100% guarantee that that'll be the wrong model. Like that'll be the wrong way to run a business, because people will cheat or be sly or game things on multiple levels, right? They'll game it on the pure straightforward inputs that you provide. They'll game it on the way you make decisions. They'll game it on your overall business model. And then all those things will mean that companies will have to consistently shift how they think about like sort of what data they collect, their various strategies, and sort of what thresholds they care about. But they'll have to consistently think about also the metagame, right? Because suddenly one day, the entire way you think about doing your business or your profit pools will disappear because it'll be totally commoditized.
Interesting. There's so many fascinating questions coming in. Some of these things that we've just been touching on could be a whole full quarter-long class, or if not a whole year-long class. But just to address one of these here, see if we can dig a little bit deeper on this one, which I think is kind of at the heart of the issue. The questioner asks, how do organizations transition to these hybrid human AI organizations? We already talked a little bit about some of the issues around the bottlenecks to look for, and right, organizational change in general being notoriously difficult. But they specifically ask, how do we make sure that this transition results in net social good in terms of either environmental impact or job placement, et cetera? This is again, this is like the $50 million question that might take a whole year-long academic class to fully answer. But if there are any particular examples that come to mind, maybe out of your portfolio companies, that might shed a little bit more light on it.
Well, sort of you look at a company that are involved with, sort of like weights and biases, which basically powers a bunch of infrastructure for machine learning. And you look at the way that they've changed how quickly people are able to build machine learning models, and also critically, how quickly you can actually instrument and understand what's working or not. And I think there's a whole set of measurements. If you look at the best companies, the best data-driven companies today, right, that one of the fascinating things about them is they collect a lot of data, but they're also super rigorous about how they think about metrics. And I think that, and then critically, they're super nuanced about how they think about metrics, and that's constantly shifting. And so I think like our ability as like not just as companies, but as individuals, but also society to sort of say, you know what, we need to measure more carefully and we need to fund measurement more carefully. I think that that's actually the thing right before us, that's the actual problem, because in thinking about specific metrics, it exposes a whole set of questions around what you really value and care about, and a whole set of difficult decisions and trade-offs. And in some ways, to me, what we've done is we've conceded our entire society to one metric, which is we've decided utility and dollars are basically equivalent. And I think that's kind of a mistake. I think that we need to have better, more robust decisions and sort of more robust discussions and debates around what are the metrics that we care about. There's another version.
There's a whole consortium of CEOs, and I think Jamie Dimon and others were involved with saying, we have focused too much on maximizing shareholder value, and we do need to incorporate other stakeholder perspectives.
That's right. And then there's another mistake, which is to say, oh, well, we can't reduce things down to metrics because the life is complex and rich. And I think that is true, but it's also true that metrics turn out to be a terrific way to coordinate large scale behavior across organizations. And so for better or worse, like that's what we've got. And so that would be sort of probably my one big encouragement and nudge.
Totally agree. I know we've got a faculty member in the department, Ramesh Johari, who's been working with a company on this measurement issue and A/B testing in particular, and just to set up the infrastructure for how to run A/B testing and to get the data structured and get those tests structured in such a way that you're not running too many tests over the same data. There's a lot of challenges there just in that, and getting companies to put down what metrics they're actually trying to optimize around and begin using data in a more rigorous way is important.
That's right. It's all part of this bigger shift, sort of as we move from the world of big data towards the world of taking data seriously. I think that shift we're just in the middle of, and that's probably like one of the more exciting things. And in some ways, maybe the thing that's more important than the AI conversation, it's like just this world in which we actually take data seriously rather than making arbitrary decisions. And so I think that's like what's exciting in front of us.
Yeah. There's maybe one or two more questions that I think we can fit in before we run out of time here, which are not easy questions to grapple with, but I think important ones. So the first one is how does AI ethics fit in? You had mentioned some skepticism around AI ethics earlier. The questioner asks, haven't heard you mention the necessity of an AI risk committee with teeth for necessary human protections.
So one of my current obsessions right now is around the idea of error correction rather than preventing errors. I think that actually in some ways, it's so hard to know exactly what the implication of something is. And far more important, at least to me, is both understanding how we'll know whether something turns out to be bad or an error, and also critically, whether we have mechanisms to roll it back, right? And so one of the funny things, I'm an investor in this company called LaunchDarkly that does software development feature flag management. And what that really means is it's very easy for you to roll a new feature out, but but critically, it's very easy to take it back if it's not working. And I think that shift in the way to think about these questions, there'll be some things where it's totally true. You need to spend time thinking about something. You'll think it through a little bit and you realize this is a terrible idea. But there'll be lots of things where you just won't know until you try, right? And I think that sort of, and so my encouragement, I think, and more often than not, is like invest more in the infrastructure in which you can roll things out and roll them back, right? Rather than promising, and of course, promising that things will really work out is a very consultant way of talking about the world. And so I'd sort of reject that. Don't do it that way, but instead think more holistically about your overall process.
Interesting. Yeah, and this also goes back to the part in there about the having the teeth involved. Reminds me again of Arvind's work, who I mentioned earlier, Karunakaran, who looks at AI evaluators. And the problem there, he conceptualizes it kind of as power without authority, or authority without power. That actually that they've got the authority to regulate AI algorithms, but often lack the power relative to the engineers or to the CTOs who are actually developing the algorithms and have the deeper domain expertise. And so it's kind of an organizational issue then at that point about how do you set these up so that it's not just an argument across the divide there without some real teeth involved to be able to pull it back.
And in some ways, this takes us full circle to the beginning of our conversation, in which I sort of contended that calling it machine learning was wrongheaded. Because one of the other reasons why calling it machine learning sort of distracts is that in the end, the models that are being built are based on judgments people made at some point. The policies that come out of these machine learning models will benefit someone, and they're built by someone. There's, go far enough down, there's always a person somewhere. And I think being able to draw, we now have it's cheap enough to digitize things now that we can actually draw these lines down. And I think holding people accountable, right? Having skin in the game rather than just saying, oh, it wasn't me, it was the model, right? I think in some ways that's far more important and far more valuable than having ethics committee with teeth, because in that case, it's more, sometimes it ends up being PR, they're not able to affect change. But saying, actually the CEO's responsible and is either gonna get fired or gonna get fined in some significant way, then that changes the calculus entirely from a PR question to a question more around risk and benefit.
Interesting. Well, let me end it with perhaps the most difficult question of all, which may just be unanswerable, but I'll toss it out there and we can at least see what your thoughts are, start a conversation around it. So the question is, if we can't even agree on climate change mitigation packages, how would AI ethics standards work? And whose standards could, should, or would it be? I know this is an issue that I hear from companies that are global enterprises with employees from all different cultures and countries, and who are operating in multiple markets are grappling with right now.
Okay, so I'm actually optimistic about that one. So like on the one hand, the fact that there are different standards and expectations across different cultures is something we just have to embrace. And the wonderful thing is actually models are very good at that, right? At sort of understanding what's like sort of the fact that, sort of I can dress this way here and I should be wearing shorts if I'm in Santa Monica, right? Machines are very good at that sort of mass personalization. So that part I feel good about. In some ways, also, I think the climate change problem in some ways is hard because the feedback loops are so long. And the wonderful thing about machine learning and AI is the feedback loops are really short. And so the questions actually are much more around transparency and visibility on the part of a whole set of different sort of actors inside the business ecosystem. And so to me, like those two together change the nature of what's possible in the AI ethics discussion, as opposed to the, sort of 5 years from now, we're all sort of like, wishing we had air conditioning, because of global warming.
Interesting. Well, let me end it here because we're running out of time, but that was pretty good with a tough question. So thanks so much for doing this with us, James. Let me turn it back over to John Robichaux and we'll wrap up.
Great. Well, I want to say thank you to Chuck and James for a fascinating discussion. Just a couple of points that I picked up on that are certainly, part of the ongoing conversation that we have here at Stanford High and at STVP. So, AI is a potential partner in helping identify places in the company that might be producing malign outcomes, but also to test opportunities for some improved social impact. And that ability to measure at a previously unimaginable scale is really important. One. Two, the ability to stress test more rapidly and all the advantages and ways to avoid large structural failures that come with that, we also heard about. The question of small data AI came up, really a hot topic right now in the world of AI, whether, because of, James, your indication that this period of over collection of data might be ending, or whether it's a means of reducing disparate outcomes and bias in algorithms generated by the small data sets when dealing with minority or unique cases. That small data AI is sort of this emerging field that we'll be watching very closely and continue to work in. Of course, that controversial statement about what's really necessary to incorporate your social strategy within a data or AI-centric transformation. Is it on the lighter side of the spectrum? I think, James, you're advocating for, or does it require a more robust set of practices in organizational design, as many folks at High often think about it? So I think that's a great setup for an ongoing conversation, both with those of us here at Stanford and those of you in the audience today. And finally, James, you did a great job encouraging us to think about, other stakeholders and really think about that double bottom line and being an evangelist here for the power of data, metrics, and measuring that AI really opens up as we think about competitive advantage and social strategies. So just what an incredible hour. Thank you both for taking the time to lead us through this exciting discussion. As a reminder to those of you in the audience, today's talk was a preview of just some of the topics that will be presented in Leading Social Impact Strategy, Harnessing the Power of Purpose and AI, an executive education program by Stanford High and Stanford STVP. You can scan this QR code, visit the link in the chat to learn more. Those of you who attended will be receiving an email with a 10% discount for that program. We hope you'll take a look at that and other opportunities, free and fee-based, that we offer throughout both High and STVP. We're here hoping to do good work and hoping to benefit the business community and our programs that are business directed, but also those of us who are thinking about these issues as global citizens, policymakers, citizenry, and elsewhere. So we thank you for joining us today. We hope you'll take the time to learn more about our offerings here at Stanford, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Have a great day.